Hey there. Tonight we begin with something a bit heavier than usual. Not emotionally, just physically. Iron, mostly. And heat. And the quiet, constant sound of hammering like a lullaby for people who find comfort in repetition and mild back pain. This isn't the tale of a knight or a king. No swords drawn in battle, no dragons, no grand banquets. This is the story of the man who made the sword, who didn't get invited to the feast because he was too busy sharpening the carving knife. So if your eyelids are feeling a little heavy and your pillow is properly fluffed, let's shuffle back in time together. Back to a little village, back to the forge. Close your eyes, take a breath, and let's drift into the quiet embers of another life. He was born just before dawn in a forge that hadn't quite gone cold yet. The coals were still faintly glowing when his first cry echoed through the workshop. Not that anyone heard it over the rooster, or the neighbor's goat who always seemed to announce himself slightly before sunrise, like some shaggy, bleating herald of the day. The midwife wrapped him in a linen cloth that had once been a flour sack, now thoroughly repurposed. She handed him over to his mother, who was already half asleep again, not because she wasn't moved by his arrival, but because she had been stoking the bellows until midnight, and giving birth was the only break she'd had all week. His father, of course, was in the corner, hammer still in hand. Not in a dramatic way. He hadn't been forging during the delivery. That would be a bit much, but because that's just where the hammer lived, in his hand. Even in sleep, his fingers curled around it like a barn cat clings to a windowsill in the wind. The boy's name was Tomas, though no one called him that until he was at least 3, because in the village you didn't name a child too early. Not out of superstition, exactly, just practicality. Infancy in medieval times was a fragile affair, and names were expensive, emotionally speaking. So until he had survived a few winters, he was simply called the little one, or more often that boy, or occasionally, watch out, he's underfoot. From the very start, Tomas's world smelled of soot and iron and something faintly charred, like the memory of burnt toast that had never been toasted. His cradle wasn't really a cradle. It was a crate lined with old wool and packed with sawdust for cushioning. There were also tongs stored underneath. Multi-use furniture was common. The walls of the forge, also their home, workshop, pantry, and social space, were a patchwork of smoke-blackened timber and stubborn cobwebs. Every beam had its own personality. One creaked in warning, one dropped cold ash when the wind changed, one just groaned for attention. Tomas grew up recognizing these sounds before he knew the alphabet, which wasn't particularly urgent since he wouldn't be learning it anyway. The days passed in a slow, smoky rhythm. The anvil was the metronome. Hammer. Pause. Hammer again. Silence, then hiss, quenching iron in the barrel. Then the low grunt of his father, which served as punctuation. By the time he could stand, Tomas had already been singed twice and nearly tripped into the coal pile at least once a week. The forge wasn't childproof because the concept of childproofing hadn't been invented. Instead, children were expected to adapt, much like cats or apprentices. It was assumed from the beginning that Tomas would take over the family trade, not because he had a passion for metallurgy, but because he was there. And in medieval economics, proximity was 9/10 of vocation. Visitors to the forge rarely noticed Tomas in those early years. He was small, quiet, and frequently covered in soot to the point of camouflage. Sometimes merchants would assume he was part of the coal pile until he moved. "Ah," they'd say, "that's a child." Right. His earliest toys were not toys. They were functional objects, slightly too broken to be useful, but too intact to throw away. A warped horseshoe, a cracked mug, the stub of a file. He played with them in the corner, arranging them into small villages of discarded usefulness. There were no knights or castles in these games, just oddly shaped lumps of future responsibility. As he grew, the forge became his classroom. Lessons were subtle. "Don't touch that. It's hot." Followed by, "I told you it was hot," and then silence as he blew on his fingers and tried not to cry in front of his father. He learned the difference between iron and steel by feel, not fact. He knew when a blade was ready to quench, not because of color or temperature charts, but because his father grunted and nodded in a very specific way. Sleep for Tomas always came with the distant sound of metal cooling, a gentle tick-tick-tick like a tired clock winding down. Some nights the forge glowed into the dark, and the shadows danced along the walls like slow, graceful ghosts, friendly ones mostly. They never asked questions. They didn't need anything. They just flickered and faded, and so Tomas grew, one ember at a time. His world was small, just the forge, the dusty path to the well, the neighbor's goat, and the smell of iron, but it was full. Not exciting, not adventurous, but full. And in that glowing little corner of the village between the hammer and the hearth, the life of a blacksmith quietly began. By the time Tomas could walk without toppling into a bucket, he was handed a small wooden hammer, not as a toy, not for fun, but because it kept his hands busy and his body out of the way. The hammer was roughly shaped, its handle splintery, and its head stained with something that might have been tar or soup or both. It had once belonged to his uncle, who is now part of a wall somewhere, according to the family story that no one elaborated on. Still, the hammer was considered an heirloom in the way that medieval objects often became treasured purely by surviving. Tomas was not expected to build anything with it. He was simply expected to carry it, to become familiar with the weight, the swing, the thud. Sometimes, when his father was deep in work, Tomas would mimic him. He'd find a loose stone, tap it with ceremonial seriousness, and then nod to himself like something had been accomplished. In truth, nothing ever was. But that wasn't the point. The forge was not a place for imagination. It was a place of repetition, of tradition, of learning through absorption. No one asked Tomas what he wanted to be when he grew up. That kind of question would have felt absurd, like asking a rock if it preferred the sun or the rain. He was going to be a blacksmith because there was a forge and because he existed. The bellows came next. When his arms grew long enough to reach both handles without slipping off the stool, his father nodded once, not twice, and handed him the task of keeping the fire alive. It was a job usually reserved for apprentices, but in the absence of wealth or options, children served just as well. The bellows were large, leather-bound, and smelled faintly of vinegar and old regret. Pulling them required effort, but the kind of effort that built slowly, like a toothache or loyalty. Tomas learned to keep a rhythm. Pull, push, wait, repeat. The fire responded, breathing deeper with every pump, the coals glowing in approval or protest. Some days the bellows stuck, and Tomas had to put his whole body into the motion. Cheeks puffed, eyes squinting, arms trembling. There were no breaks, only pauses when the iron needed time to heat. Those were his moments of rest, brief, still, and entirely unsatisfying. Play was not a concept Tomas understood. If it didn't involve soot or tools or ash under the nails, it didn't really count. The other village boys would run past the open doorway, laughing and chasing a hoop with a stick or daring each other to touch the goat that bit. Tomas sometimes watched them through the smoke, one hand still on the bellows, and wondered if they were training for something he hadn't heard of. Occasionally, one of them would shout his name, well, not his name, but something close enough, but he wouldn't answer. He couldn't. The forge didn't have a back door, and the front was only ever open to customers. It wasn't that he was forbidden from going outside. It was just that no one thought to mention the possibility. The air inside was always warm, always filled with the scent of scorched metal and singed hair, and Tomas had come to associate that smell with comfort, or at least familiarity. There were no games in the forge, no balls, no dolls, no carved animals. Instead, Tomas played with the things that surrounded him, the oddly shaped nails, the curled shavings of cooled iron, the spare handle of a hammer long broken and never repaired. Once, he tried to balance a spoon on the edge of the anvil, just to see if it would stay. It didn't. It bounced off, clattered to the floor, and rolled into the corner where things went to be forgotten. That corner was crowded, tools waiting for a second life. Projects that had outlived their purpose before they'd even begun, a chain that no longer connected anything, a wheel hub that dreamed of a cart. Tomas added to that pile sometimes, quietly, without guilt. His father rarely spoke during the day, reserving his voice for grunts and warnings. But once, when the forge was calm and the coals had settled into a low simmer, he pointed to a half-formed horseshoe and said, "That's wrong." It was unclear whether he meant the shape or the idea behind it. Tomas nodded anyway. That was the first real lesson. He began to recognize wrongness, the way metal shouldn't bend, the color it shouldn't turn, the spark it shouldn't make. These were not things you learned from books. Not that there were any books. Not here. Not for people who used hammers more often than spoons. Meals were eaten quickly, without ceremony. Bread dipped in something vaguely liquid, dried meat that required more chewing than it was worth. If Tomas finished early, he was allowed to sit near the hearth with his hands outstretched, warming fingers that were already too calloused for his age. His mother rarely spoke during meals. She spent most of her time preparing, cleaning, sewing, or stoking smaller fires that never quite warmed the room. Her life, too, was shaped by heat and silence. At night, Tomas slept in a corner, curled against the wall beside the rack of tools. His blanket smelled of iron. His pillow was a folded apron. Dreams came slow, and when they came, they were rarely vivid. Just shapes and noise, the clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the low hum of the fire saying nothing at all. Days blurred together, marked only by the difference in what needed repairing. Some mornings began with shoeing a horse, others with reforging a latch. Every task was the same, but different, like bread baked in the same oven, but slightly overdone each time. Once during a quiet afternoon, Tomas found a moth clinging to the edge of the bellows. It flapped its wings once, then settled again, as if uncertain whether to stay or flee. He watched it for a while, longer than he should have, until his father noticed and barked something that sounded like "focus." The moth was gone the next morning, probably cooked, probably forgotten. The hammer stayed in Tomas's hand, even as he grew, even as the leather straps of the bellows began to soften and the forge filled with the tools of half a lifetime. The wooden hammer never left its place. He didn't use it much anymore, but it stayed close, like something waiting, like something he might still grow into if the fire didn't claim him first. The days continued, and so did the rhythm. Pull, push, wait, repeat, and still no one had asked him if he wanted any of it. There was no ceremony, no nod of approval, no declaration of apprenticeship. One day Tomas was just a boy with a wooden hammer. The next he was holding tongs with real heat at the other end. That was how it started, not with a lesson, but with an assumption. He had grown to the height of the stool, maybe a bit taller, maybe not, and that was apparently the threshold. Somewhere between outgrowing the corner he slept in and being able to lift the coal bucket without dragging it, the forge decided he was ready, or perhaps it was his father who decided, or maybe his mother, or maybe no one at all. In truth, no one remembered exactly when Tomas began working in earnest. He couldn't either. Time was a flexible thing inside the forge, stretched out by the rhythm of tasks that all blurred into each other like smoke that refused to leave. Days were measured by which tool broke, which blade dulled, which customer shouted. Age, as a concept, didn't have much weight here. No one celebrated birthdays. If someone asked how old he was, the closest answer would have been old enough to lift without tipping or young enough to still have 10 fingers. That was sufficient. He began his apprenticeship without title or wage. His pay came in the form of food, silence, and the occasional grunted approval that might have been praise. Most days began before light. The village cockerel was often beaten to his duty by the coughing of the forge chimney. Tomas would rise with the smoke, rubbing ash from his eyes, and stumble to the hearth before his legs fully remembered how to stand. Breakfast was eaten standing, bread with the corner burned, a sip of water with a taste of copper. Then, into position. The tasks were endless but consistent. Sweep the ash, organize the scraps, relight the coals that had sulked overnight into coldness. He did not ask questions. That was not encouraged. If something was unclear, he watched until it became less unclear. If something burned him, he learned not to touch it again. And if something broke in his hands, he learned how to pretend it had been cracked already. He wasn't taught so much as absorbed into the forge like a splinter that never got removed. There were rules, but they were unwritten. Stand clear when the hammer lifts. Quench away from your face. Never insult a noble's blade, even if it wobbles like boiled cabbage. His father's voice remained sparse. Instructions were short and mostly vowel-based, but his gestures were precise. A nod meant continue. A grunt meant adjust. A scowl meant redo it without whining. Tomas quickly learned to interpret expressions like a second language. The first real task given to him, one that actually affected the outcome of a finished product, was holding the tongs. Not just any tongs, large, heavy ones with a rusted hinge and a mind of their own. His job was to grip the heated iron, keep it steady on the anvil, and not let it slip when his father brought the hammer down. Simple, in theory. In practice, it was a delicate, painful, terrifying dance between balance and instinct. The metal writhed with heat as if it knew it was being tamed. The tongs bit his palms through the gloves, which were too big and smelled like someone else's fear. His father didn't explain what they were making. Tomas didn't ask. That wasn't how the forge worked. You did the thing, and if it survived the quenching, then you could call it something. Knife, hinge, hook, nail. The names came later. First came the noise. Hammer on iron, iron on anvil, hiss of steam as the metal met the barrel. Tomas flinched the first dozen times. After that, his body began to treat it like weather. Unpleasant, unavoidable, not worth reacting to. He grew stronger without noticing. His arms thickened from lifting buckets and swinging tools. His back learned to bend without complaint. His hands, once small and soft, now bore the grayish hue of permanent contact with soot and steel. The black under his nails stopped washing out. At night, when he collapsed into sleep, he often dreamed of hammers falling in slow motion. Not nightmares, just repetition. A rhythm that followed him even when the forge went dark. He didn't know any songs, but he knew the beat of work. The other boys in the village still played. He could hear them outside, their laughter echoing faintly through the cracks in the wall, but it no longer occurred to him that he might join. His world was smaller, shaped like a rectangle of heat and iron and dust. The village itself became background noise. Faces blurred, names forgotten. Customers came and went. A farmer needing a spade. A merchant needing a lock repaired. A knight wanting his sword to look more intimidating, though he never actually used it. Tomas watched them all with the same quiet stare. Not rude, just distant, as if they were passing through a dream he hadn't fully committed to. On market days, his mother would leave early to barter, returning with whatever she could trade for a few iron nails and a half-mended bridle. Tomas never asked what she brought. He simply ate what appeared and used what remained. Once, she came home with a scarf loosely woven the color of dried hay. She draped it around his neck without comment. It stayed there for a week until it caught fire briefly while he was leaning too close to the forge. After that, he never wore scarves or color. His world, much like the forge, had only 3 shades: red, black, and the flickering gray between. He began recognizing tools not by name but by feel, the weight of each hammer, the curve of each tong. Even blindfolded, though that never happened, he could have picked out the punch from the drift, the rasp from the fuller. His fingers remembered shapes better than his tongue remembered words. Occasionally, his father would leave him alone with a task. Small things, like straightening nails or tempering horseshoe blanks. He would nod once, then disappear behind the curtain that separated the forge from their cramped living space. Tomas would hold his breath during those moments, not because of fear, but because silence felt strange. Without the older man's footsteps, the forge seemed too still, too expectant, like it was watching. He never tried to leave. There was nowhere to go. And even if there were, the forge would notice. The fire would cool too quickly. The tools would go missing. The dust would settle in places that should never be still. His place was here. It had been decided, perhaps before he was even born. So he kept working, kept holding, kept hammering. Not his own hammer, not yet, but the motions were the same. His muscles grew into the roll, his breath matched the pace of the bellows, and his eyes began to flicker like embers, always alert, always aware of what came next, even before it was spoken. There was still no pay. No paramis. Just the next task, waiting quietly beside the glowing coals and the silent understanding that tomorrow would look exactly the same. Mornings in the forge did not begin with sunlight. They began with smoke, not the gentle, swirling kind that dances lazily across a candle, but thick, assertive smoke rising from the half-alive coals that had sulked through the night, waiting to be coaxed back into usefulness. Tomas no longer needed anyone to wake him. The forge itself did the job. Its drafty timbers creaked with the wind. The faint scent of smoldering ash, always present, sharpened just before dawn like a whisper in the nose. His eyes opened before he remembered he was awake. Limbs moved automatically. Boots went on the wrong feet, then the right. He fumbled toward the hearth, the way a sleepwalker might stumble toward memory. His mother had already passed through some time before him, leaving a half-loaf of bread on the stool near the door. Stale, slightly damp, but edible. He looked at it. Didn't take it. Not yet. Instead, he headed straight for the coal bin. It was always lower than he remembered, or he was taller. The shovel, a dented, blistered thing that had never once been sharp, waited beside it like an old hound. He scooped without thinking. 2 scoops. 3. Each landing with a soft clatter that barely disturbed the silence. The coals hissed as they landed on the embers, protesting the intrusion. He reached for the iron poker, the long one with the split end, and jabbed gently into the heap. The movement was supposed to be circular, rhythmic, precise. Today it was more of a sleepy jab, and that, unfortunately, was when his father emerged. Not with a shout. That wasn't his way. Just a single gravel-laced word, slow. It wasn't loud, but it landed hard, not because it was unfair. Tomas had, in fact, forgotten to stir properly, but because it was true. And truth, when delivered without padding, tended to sting in the places that didn't bruise. He didn't respond. That was another rule. You didn't argue with judgment. You adjusted. His hands moved faster now. The poker sliced more evenly. The bellows followed, 1 push, 1 pull, the leather groaning with the effort. The fire responded in kind. It was always hungry in the morning, needing coaxing, then roaring back with sudden intensity, like someone who woke up grumpy and remembered they had unfinished business. The coals turned orange, then yellow at the core. Heat pushed at his face like a living thing. Tomas stepped back, sweat forming instantly at the top of his brow. His father grunted again, this time not quite as sharp. Possibly approval. possibly just the way his back sounded when he stretched. The forge didn't explain itself. Once the fire was breathing properly, Tomas turned to the water barrel. It had frozen at the top. He cracked it with the back of a hammer, the ice breaking like the crust of burnt bread. He dipped a cloth into the water, wiped his hands, then his face, and finally remembered the bread. He took a bite. It was colder than he liked, but he was already chewing before he could change his mind. Halfway through the second bite, he paused. Had he eaten yesterday? The thought came uninvited, slippery, and vague. He couldn't remember. Possibly yes, possibly not. His stomach gave no hints. Hunger had become a background hum in his life, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, but always present, like the ringing after a blacksmith's strike. He finished the bread anyway. It tasted of ash and something faintly sweet, though that may have been an illusion left over from last week's honeycomb that he still thought about. His father had begun sorting tools by now. The ritual was the same each morning. Tongs placed to the left of the anvil, hammers arranged by weight and severity, punches and drifts laid out on the workbench like surgical instruments preparing for a long, loud operation. Tomas joined in, matching his movements to the pattern he had seen every day since he was tall enough to reach the table without standing on a crate. Each tool had a place. Each place had a reason. There was no room for improvisation. Improvisation was chaos, and chaos did not belong near fire. As the forge warmed, so did the noise. The wind outside pushed against the walls. The coals popped. Somewhere in the back, water from the thatch above dripped onto an unused anvil, producing a rhythmic tap like a forgotten clock. His father handed him a billet, a short bar of iron, rough-edged and cold. "Hinges," he muttered. Tomas nodded. That meant 12 pieces. Uniform, drilled at the ends, folded to shape. Functional, not decorative. The kind of work that required endurance, not inspiration. He liked hinges. They were honest. You hit the metal until it obeyed. You drilled a hole, you bent the edge, you moved on. There was comfort in tasks that didn't pretend to be more than they were. He placed the first billet into the coals. Waited. Watched. The metal darkened first, then began to glow at the edges. When it was ready, when it reached that faint orange blush like a shy sunrise, he pulled it free and brought it to the anvil. The first strike missed by a breath. The second landed true. The third rang out across the forge like a statement no one asked for. Outside, the village was stirring. He could hear the carts being dragged through mud, the roosters giving their second opinions, the early complaints of farmers who had already run out of excuses to go back to bed. But Tomas stayed focused on the billet. Strike. Losen Craig Wolls Strawview and service the boys. Strike again. Flatten the edge. Reheat. Repeat. His father joined beside him with a larger piece. Something curved, possibly a scythe blade. They worked in tandem, their hammers echoing in different tones. One sharp, one deep. Together they sounded like an argument between thunder and reason. Tomas didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew the pattern. He knew the pace. The morning had found its rhythm now, even if it had started with a stumble. The fire had been slow. He had been slow. But the forge had forgiven them both. It always did, eventually. Provided they didn't push their luck. The first hinge was cooling now, resting on the edge of the table, still smoking slightly. Tomas reached for the second billet, hands already moving before thought caught up. There was still time before midday, before the sun would shine through the one high window and briefly illuminate the back wall like a forgotten chapel. And there were still 11 more hinges waiting for their turn in the fire. Bellows work, like most things in the forge, wasn't something anyone sat you down and taught. It was something you learned by failing quietly until no one corrected you anymore. Tomas had grown used to the rhythm of hammer and hinge, of turning metal under weight and pressure, but stoking the fire was a different kind of ritual. It was less about strength, more about feel, less noise, more breath, and ironically, less fire, more smoke. The bellows stood like a leathery beast in the corner, drooping slightly when idle, wheezing when overused. Each morning, Tomas approached it with a mixture of respect and resignation. It had been patched so many times it resembled a map of places no one wanted to visit. The leather creaked when he touched it, like a grandfather stretching his back in protest. The iron nozzle that fed into the hearth had a thin layer of soot that never quite disappeared, no matter how many times it was scraped clean. Pulling the handles required balance. Pushing them too fast suffocated the flame. Too slow, and the coals cooled with a sulk that could last the whole day. Tomas learned to watch for signs, not just in the fire, but in himself. A good breath from the bellows should produce a bloom of orange, sometimes yellow if the iron was eager. But too many pumps too close together, and the forge would answer not with heat, but with a long, slow cloud of smoke that poured out like disapproval. His father, naturally, noticed this immediately. The smoke would barely begin its crawl up the chimney before the old man's voice cut through the haze. Too fast. Or sometimes just a grunt, the kind that meant, "What did I teach you about breathing into the fire like you're trying to drown it?" Tomas adjusted accordingly, though sometimes too late. There were mornings when the smoke clung to his clothes, thick as fog, curling into his hair, his eyes, his lungs. It was not the kind of smoke that made you think of campfires or cozy evenings. It was the kind that turned your throat to sand and made your eyes feel like poorly cut onions had developed a grudge. He coughed often, not the light, polite cough of someone clearing their throat, but the raw, involuntary bark of someone trying not to inhale anything solid. The forge never smelled clean. Even when the coals were burning true, there was always a lingering bitterness in the air, like the memory of something scorched too long ago to name. His face, pale most mornings, took on a blotchy red hue as the day progressed. By midday, after enough rounds with the bellows, he could feel the heat rising from his collar, dripping down his back and blooming into his cheeks. The color of the iron was easier to read. A deep red meant it was warming. Bright orange meant it was ready. Yellow meant it needed attention right now, or it would melt into a useless pool that no amount of hammering could reshape. Tomas began to measure temperature not by numbers. He had never seen numbers used that way, but by instinct, the flicker of a spark. The way the metal moved when lifted with tongs, the particular sound it made when touched to the anvil, and sometimes by the color of his own face in the polished belly of a kettle left near the fire. When the smoke was too thick, his skin turned a strange sort of green, like a boiled cabbage trying to blend in. It wasn't a healthy look. But in the forge, appearance was not a currency that spent well. He kept working, coughing quietly, blinking back tears that had nothing to do with emotion. Once, during a particularly cold morning, the fire refused to catch properly. The wood was damp. The coal was sulking. Tomas pumped the bellows slowly, carefully, but the smoke still coiled out like a warning. He tried stirring the coals, added more kindling, even whispered something that might have been encouragement, but the smoke only thickened. His father appeared behind him, silent until the exact moment Tomas wiped his sleeve across his face and smeared soot across his nose. "You're strangling it," the old man said. "Not cruel, just factual." Tomas nodded, stepped back. His father took the bellows in hand, adjusted the angle slightly, and pumped once, then again, with a pause between, like punctuation. The fire responded with a reluctant roar, as if waking from a bad dream. Tomas watched closely. The fire hadn't needed more air. It had needed less panic, less desperation, a steadier hand. That was the lesson, though no one said it aloud. From that day forward, he worked slower. Not lazier, just calmer. The bellows became less a tool and more an extension of breathing. He began to move with the fire, not against it. And in return, the forge coughed less, though he still did. The ash in the air was unavoidable. It settled on his skin like a second layer, filled the space behind his eyes, sat at the back of his throat like something waiting its turn. By the end of each day, his voice sounded older than he was, ragged, rough, like a man who had forgotten what silence felt like. But he never complained. Complaining didn't change the air. It didn't clear the chimney. It didn't make the coals any brighter. So he coughed, and then he continued. The smoke taught patience. It taught stillness. And sometimes, when he leaned too close, it taught him how long a man could hold his breath before wisdom arrived. His mother once handed him a cloth soaked in vinegar, told him to tie it around his face when the air got thick. He tried it for a few days, but the cloth smelled worse than the forge, and it made breathing feel like drinking through a hole in the ground. He stopped using it. Instead, he learned to inhale shallow, in through the side of the mouth, out through the nose, a dance of restraint, an art of not noticing. He grew thinner that year. His appetite faded slightly, though it was unclear whether from the smoke or the bread. The forge did not offer days off. It offered muscle and memory and heat, and in return, it asked for nothing more than everything you had left at the end of the week. Sometimes, when no one was watching, Tomas would pause at the bellows. He would look into the heart of the fire, where the coals shimmered like waiting thoughts, and wonder, not deeply, not dangerously, just briefly, what it might feel like to breathe air that didn't taste like work. But then the iron would shift. A new billet would be placed on the anvil. His father would nod or grunt or simply move aside. And Tomas, hands blackened, face streaked with smoke, would take the handles of the bellows once more, feeling the weight of the air in his chest and listen closely for the color of the fire. The first time Tomas held a real hammer, not the splintered toy from childhood, not the stub-handled piece for practice, but a full iron-headed tool with a handle shaped by generations of palms, he felt nothing unusual. No spark, no thrill, no weight beyond the literal. It didn't feel like inheritance. It felt like obligation, which was, in the forge, almost the same thing. His father handed it to him one afternoon without a word, and Tomas accepted it the way he accepted bread or instruction or cold wind through the chimney, naturally. Without ceremony, the hammer was not especially large nor especially elegant. It had a slight chip on the right edge of the head and a grip darkened by years of sweat and soot. It had no markings. It bore no initials. It didn't need them. Everyone in the forge knew which hammer was which by their sound. This one had a deep, muffled thud, like the noise you'd expect from knocking on a door that didn't want company. Tomas raised it, adjusted his grip once, and struck his first blow against the billet on the anvil. The iron shuddered. The anvil absorbed. The sound echoed gently, not loudly but persistently, like someone tapping on the inside of a thought. He struck again, and again. Each blow consistent, each angle checked and rechecked by feel more than sight. His father stood beside him for the first 10 strikes, then wandered back to the grindstone without a word. That was approval, or the closest thing to it. The hammer, now part of his routine, became an extension of something older than muscle. Not an act of force, not even an act of creation, but something simpler, a rhythm. Tomas learned that the true function of hammering was not always to shape, it was to continue. In a forge where smoke clouded thought and fire blurred the line between morning and night, the repetition of hammering was the only measure of time that mattered. Clang. Shift. Clang again. Pause. The rhythm didn't change with the task. Hinges, hooks, blades, nails, it didn't matter. The beat remained, even when the billet cooled too fast, even when the handle slipped slightly in a sweaty palm, even when the fire moaned and the bellows stuttered, hammering continued. There were days when Tomas struck without knowing exactly what he was making. He wasn't told. He wasn't supposed to ask. His father would hand him a length of iron, gesture vaguely, and that was enough. The shape would reveal itself through motion. A curve suggested a latch. A taper meant a spike. A fold hinted at a hinge. But in truth, it was the hammering that made it real. The object didn't exist until the rhythm carved it into memory. He began to hear the forge in percussive phrases, the tick of tongs on stone, the hiss of steam from quenching, the shift of coals under a poker. All of it layered behind the steady beat of the hammer like instruments in a grim, soot-covered orchestra. He couldn't read music, but he knew when the tempo was off, and he could fix it. Not by adjusting his hands, but by adjusting his breath. Even sleep didn't break the rhythm anymore. He would wake in the night and hear his own heartbeat echoing the cadence of the forge, sometimes fast, sometimes dragging, but always present. Even in dreams, he was hammering something vague and glowing, not with urgency, but with inevitability. And when he woke, his fingers were already curled, as if gripping the handle still. His hands developed a stiffness that no soaking could soothe. The joints began to throb when the rain was coming. His nails, once bitten short, grew crooked from repeated blows and accidental pinches. He never complained. He didn't know what complaint would sound like. The hammer didn't ask for conversation. It asked for rhythm. And Tomas gave it. There were moments during long stretches of work when he forgot where he was in the day, not because he was distracted, but because the hammering erased the need to mark time. There was no lunch bell, no clock, just the changing angle of the light through the chimney's mouth and the way the coals softened in color as the sun shifted. But Tomas didn't need those markers. The hammer told him when to rest, not with words, but with weight. When his arm trembled too soon after a strike, it meant he'd worked too long. When the hammer began to wobble in his grip, it meant the day was nearly done. But until that moment, there was only forward, only the next strike. His father, older now, worked alongside him still, though with slightly less fury than before. His blows were fewer, but heavier, each one deliberate, as if reminding the metal of something it had forgotten. Tomas watched him sometimes, not out of admiration, though perhaps there was some, but out of understanding. They shared the same rhythm now. Not exactly in sync, but close enough that the forge no longer noticed who was leading. One day, a customer, a rare one, a nobleman from somewhere that mattered, stepped into the workshop. He watched Tomas for a few minutes, arms crossed, face neutral. "You've got a good arm," he said finally. Tomas nodded, struck again. "How long you been at it?" Tomas didn't answer. Not because he was shy, but because he genuinely didn't know. The nobleman laughed once, short and surprised, then left. Tomas didn't think about it again. He struck the billet once more, folded it, flattened the edge, and turned it with the tongs. The hammer rose and fell. The shape beneath it changed. The rhythm stayed the same. There were days the hammer felt heavier than usual, even though its weight never changed. That was usually after nights when the fire took longer to settle or when the bread was too stale to chew properly. But he didn't adjust the pace. He simply let the ache fold itself into the motion, like water finding a groove in stone. Some mornings his knuckles ached before his feet touched the ground. Some evenings his shoulder clicked like a gear losing teeth. But none of it mattered if the hammer still fell true, because in the forge, forging was not a choice. It was a pulse. a presence. The duty whispered in every creak of wood and crackle of fire. And the hammer, patient and permanent, was both witness and judge. Tomas no longer questioned whether he liked the work. That was a question for people with hours to spare. He didn't do it for enjoyment or pride or craft. He did it because the forge demanded rhythm, because the metal required obedience, because the hammer had found his hand and never asked to be returned. And in that endless, glowing space between flame and steel, Tomas lifted the hammer once more, not to finish something, but to continue something older than both of them. There wasn't a bell that rang to signal a break. No whistle, no clear division between work and rest. Just a moment when the hammer stopped falling and no one reached for the next piece of iron. That was when Tomas knew it was time. Not because someone said so, but because the forge for once held its breath. He placed the hammer gently on the workbench, not because it was fragile, hammers never were, but because setting it down softly made it feel less like quitting. His father had already moved to the corner bench, the one with the split in the middle where the wood bowed inward from years of body weight and heat. Tomas joined him, though not always right away. Today he did. His hands were warm from the haft. His eyes stung slightly, not from the fire, but from the concentration of a morning spent shaping something that didn't want to be shaped. He didn't look at his father. He looked at the fire. That was the ritual. Sit down. Stare. Say nothing. The forge, when quiet, didn't lose its heat. It just changed its sound. Without hammering, without the grind of metal on stone or the slap of tongs on anvil, it hummed, not musically, more like the soft rustling of coals settling into themselves, or the faint pop of sap caught in firewood that shouldn't have been damp. Tomas watched the bed of coals, still pulsing red and orange beneath a thin veil of ash. It looked like it was breathing. A slow, deliberate kind of breathing, the kind that came not from lungs but from memory. The fire didn't flicker when you stared at it long enough. It just shimmered like a thought trying to form. He found himself doing that often, staring into it, not searching for answers, not exactly, but wondering if maybe the fire had some it wasn't quite ready to give up. Not that Tomas had many questions, or maybe he did, but they weren't the kind that fit into words. They were more like noticings. The way his fingers sometimes ached before he touched anything. The way his shoulder made a grinding noise on cold mornings. The way the rhythm of his hammering lingered in his chest even now when everything else was still. The bench beneath him creaked faintly as he shifted. The wood was warm always from being so close to the hearth. It smelled faintly of old sweat and the kind of ash that never left your clothes no matter how many times they were beaten against the river stones. His father exhaled once, long and low, like someone remembering a sigh from last week and deciding now was the time to let it out. Tomas didn't speak. He rarely did during these moments. Speaking would feel like stepping on something sacred, though neither of them would have used that word. The fire was sacred only in the sense that it was necessary, like breath, or bread, or gravity. Across the room, the tools hung in their usual places: hooks, hammers, tongs, files, punches, wedges, pliers, each resting quietly as if sleeping. The forge was a strange place when it wasn't noisy, almost soft, like it was waiting politely for them to finish thinking. Tomas leaned forward, elbows on knees, and let the heat brush against his face. Not enough to burn, but enough to remind him he was still close to the thing that defined his days. The fire was honest. Brutal, sometimes, but honest. It never lied about its temperature, never pretended to be anything it wasn't. It burned what you gave it, gave back what it could, and that was that. Outside, somewhere beyond the thick walls and soot-dimmed windows, the village carried on. Horses snorted. Wheels creaked. Someone's child wailed like it had discovered betrayal for the first time. But inside, in this small patch of warmth and quiet, the world felt reduced to embers and breath. Tomas picked up a splinter of wood from the floor. It had broken off from one of the kindling pieces earlier, now lying unnoticed near the edge of the hearth. He turned it over in his fingers once, then twice, then dropped it gently onto the coals. It flared briefly, curled at the edges, then disappeared into the glow like it had never existed separately. He thought of questions he might ask if the fire ever answered. Simple ones. Why does the hammer feel heavier some days? Why does the smoke cling longer after rain? Why do some billets seem to resist shaping like they're made of memory instead of iron? But he didn't ask. The fire wouldn't answer. And perhaps that was the point. Some things just needed to be burned through, not explained. His father shifted again, letting one boot scuff against the floor, a low scrape of leather on stone, then silence. They stayed there a while longer, not measuring time by clock or bell, but by the slow settling of the coals. Eventually, the heat would dip just enough to signal that rest had lasted long enough. The iron waiting on the workbench would grow cold. The rhythm would need restarting, but not yet. For now, there was just this pause, this rare, still space between action and continuation. Tomas leaned back slightly, stretched one leg out, and let his heel rest on the packed dirt floor. The fire crackled once, quietly, like a cough from someone trying not to interrupt. The tools remained still, the walls held their breath, and Tomas watched the embers shift again, wondering not what they meant, but how long they would glow before needing to be fed once more. The pause by the fire was over before it had properly begun. Tomas could tell by the shift in his father's posture, a lean forward, a grunt not of fatigue but of returning to duty, and the subtle tilt of the head toward the workbench. That was the signal, though it never needed to be spoken. Rest was not meant to be savored, only acknowledged. The tools were where they'd left them, though the hammer felt slightly colder now, slightly heavier as it passed from rest back into rhythm. Tomas was just about to reach for the half-finished latch that he paused on when the sound of hooves approached from outside, clipped, too careful, the way expensive horses tended to step when their riders thought too much of their own importance. The rhythm of the forge shifted before the door even opened. His father looked up but said nothing. Tomas didn't sigh, not out loud, but his shoulders dropped the way they did when the day decided to offer something extra. The door swung open with a practiced flare. Not a gust of wind, not even the chill, just a motion rehearsed in the mind of someone who believed entrances were a form of punctuation. The nobleman from earlier in the week stood in the doorway, gloves in one hand, the reins of his steed barely held in the other, as if he expected someone else to handle that part. "It's making a noise," he said, skipping any greeting, which wasn't unusual. "When I'd a sound. You remember the one you fit yesterday?" Tomas did remember. It was the fourth one that day. The horse had been unusually compliant, and the nobleman had insisted on supervising the process like he was overseeing the construction of a cathedral. "It whistles," the man added. "Only at a trot, maybe a canter. Either way, it's unacceptable." Tomas didn't point out that horseshoes didn't whistle. Not on their own. Not unless they were enchanted or singing farewell songs, which they weren't. His father gestured toward the post by the door. The nobleman guided the horse forward with a flourish, as if the act of tying a beast to a wooden pole required choreography. The horse snorted, but did not protest. It was the kind of horse bred more for posture than performance. Tomas approached it with quiet hands. The creature recognized him, or at least the smell of the forge, and lifted its front leg without fuss. He crouched, examined. The shoe was intact, solid, fitted to the hoof with the kind of precision that didn't leave much room for noise. He tapped it with the back of a file. No rattle, no give. But still, the nobleman stood over him, arms crossed, waiting not for an explanation, but for resolution. "We'll refit it," Tomas's father said. The tone implied it wasn't a debate. The nobleman nodded as if granting permission, then stepped back to examine a wall sconce as though considering one for his estate. Tomas fetched the tools. Pulling a shoe wasn't difficult, but doing it carefully, without damaging the hoof, without bending the shoe beyond recovery, required a practiced touch. This one came off cleanly. He brushed the hoof, checked the wall for splits, found none. The nails had held firm. Still, he knew better than to offer an opinion. He carried the horseshoe back to the bench, laid it on the anvil, and studied it in silence. His father joined him, picked it up, turned it in his hand, then tapped it twice against the metal plate as if listening for a confession. "Lighten the curve," he said. That was all. Tomas nodded. He heated the iron just enough to make it pliable, not molten. The fire, still steady from earlier, accepted the task without complaint. He watched the edges begin to glow, pulled it just before it softened too much, and laid it flat on the anvil. He struck not to change its shape, but to suggest a gentler bend, the kind that would change nothing functionally but might shift a sound or more likely the expectation of a sound. The hammering was lighter this time, not for lack of strength, but because the task itself was almost symbolic. Still, Tomas found the rhythm. Even in this small act of appeasement, the forge expected precision. He quenched the horseshoe, not fully, just enough to temper the adjustments, then polished the edge with a quick file. When he looked up, the nobleman was still by the door, now examining a rusted plow hook with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "Ready?" Tomas said. It was the only word he'd spoken all morning. The horse lifted its leg again without being asked, a quiet partner in a quiet complaint. Tomas nailed the shoe back on, using slightly shorter nails this time, more to change the pressure than the fit. It seated perfectly. He pressed gently, checked the give. Nothing moved. No whistle, no groan. He stepped back. "Try now," his father said, waving a hand like a priest dismissing a confession. The nobleman led the horse out, mounted with a practiced hop, and trotted a small circle in the muddy patch outside the forge. No one breathed. The hooves struck the ground cleanly. The sound was the same as before, but the nobleman's face softened. "Better," he said. "Yes, I think that fixed it." Tomas didn't nod. He just walked back inside. The hammer waited where he left it. His father followed a moment later, pulling the door shut against the wind that had picked up while they worked. "Again," he said simply, pointing toward the next piece of iron. Tomas picked it up, placed it on the anvil, and raised the hammer. There was no resentment, not even fatigue, just continuation, just the next rhythm waiting its turn. Outside, the nobleman's horse faded into the distance, its hooves no longer singing their mysterious song, or perhaps still singing, but to ears less determined to hear it. Inside, the fire crackled once more, and Tomas struck the metal again, the day carrying forward as if the interruption had only been another part of the rhythm all along. The nobleman's horse had barely disappeared beyond the edge of the village road when Tomas turned back to the bench, wiped his palms on his apron, and reached for the iron rod meant for nails. The rod was long, rough, and uncut, still black from where it had been forged into the rough stock used for small work. His father didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The pile of empty wooden bins to the left of the hearth said everything. There had been a delivery cart in the early morning, one that arrived before dawn, before even Tomas had stirred. A builder from the southern edge of the market road had ordered enough nails to make a roof groan under its own weight. Or perhaps the nails were going into fences, or carts, or boats. Tomas didn't know, and he didn't ask. It didn't matter where nails went. They didn't have stories. They just had heads and points and a purpose that didn't include explanation. Making nails wasn't complicated. That wasn't the problem. It was that they required no thought, no challenge, just patience, just repetition. Take the rod, heat the end, cut to length, shape the head, Draw out the point. Quench. Drop. Repeat. It was not forging. It was not creating. It was surviving. And today, the bins were all empty. The forge was quieter now, the roar of fire receding into its calmer phase like a beast resting between meals. The coals still glowed, but not with urgency. Tangbos fed them just enough to keep them willing. He cut the first length of rod, short, maybe 2 inches, and placed it into the fire. There was no ceremony to this, no pause for admiration. Nails didn't inspire pride, only blisters. He watched the tip turn red, then orange. With tongs, he brought it to the anvil's small square horn, the one worn flat from this exact task. He struck quickly, once to set the shape, again to form the head, then drew the body into a taper. A sharp tip, but not too sharp. Nails didn't need to be clever. They just needed to hold things together. He quenched the piece, dropped it into the half-filled bucket near his feet. It landed with a soft clink, joining its siblings like a whisper in an echo chamber. Then he reached for the next piece, and again, and again. Within the first hour, his fingers stopped responding to texture. The iron no longer felt hot or cold, just necessary. His arms moved on their own, guided by habit, not intention. The hammer fell with a rhythm too soft for attention, too precise for thought. In this work, there was no room for daydreams. The fire needed watching. The angles needed checking. A single misaligned head meant the nail would bend sideways when used. Tomas had learned that long ago. Bent nails came back, sometimes in handfuls, sometimes with curses. "These are no better than reeds," one man had said. His father hadn't responded, just made Tomas reforge the entire batch. After that, he learned the head needed to be square. Always. No exception. His thumb began to ache midway through the second bin. The muscle between finger and palm throbbed like it was chewing on its own regret. He ignored it. He shifted his grip, changed the angle. The pain adjusted, moved lower. That was fine. He worked on. There was something oddly soothing in the monotony. Not joyful, but steady. Making nails was like counting backwards from a number no one had told you. 1 nail, 2, 5, 20, 50. Still not enough. Not even close. Sometimes he imagined he was racing himself, seeing if his body could outpace his boredom. Could he make 10 nails in the time it took the coal to dim slightly? Could he finish a bin before the bucket filled with steam from quenched tips? But the games didn't last. They weren't fun. Just ways to shape the silence into something that didn't echo quite so loud. His father worked beside him, quieter than usual, repairing a hinge that had bent inward from use. He didn't look up. Tomas didn't either. Words weren't needed here. The forge didn't welcome chatter. Talking near fire always felt disrespectful, as if the flames themselves were trying to concentrate. The third bin began to show signs of progress. The nails formed a pile like metal seeds, waiting to sprout something no one would ever admire. He stopped counting. That helped. It made the task feel less like an obligation and more like the weather, something to be endured. His hand by now had fully numbed. He couldn't tell whether he was holding the hammer or just imagining it. The handle left a print in his skin when he set it down to stretch briefly, his fingers opening like a rusted hinge, slow and unwilling. He flexed them once, twice, then reached for the next piece of rod. The fire hadn't dimmed. The coals stayed warm, faithful, asking only to be fed and not forgotten. Tomas fed it. He hadn't looked at the window in hours. The light had shifted, maybe, or not. It didn't matter. There were still bins to fill. He shaped another head, flattened it, pinched the body into a clean taper, and sent it into the bucket. The steam rose with a hiss, a momentary voice in a room that otherwise listened far too much. His neck ached now, the kind of ache that suggested the weight of the day was beginning to settle in places where it wouldn't be asked to leave. He shifted his stance, planted one foot forward, and began again. Another cut, another heat, another strike. Making nails wasn't glorious, but it filled the hours. It didn't ask for beauty, it asked for reliability. And in a forge that knew the worth of silence and rhythm more than speech or applause, that was almost the same thing. Tomas bent over the next piece of rod, hands moving like they remembered something his mind had already forgotten, and the forge hummed in quiet agreement, the fire waiting patiently for the next moment of repetition. The pile of nails had grown high enough to cover the bottom of the final bin, not full, not nearly, but enough to suggest that progress in its own quiet way was being made. Tomas didn't notice right away that his hands were shaking. It wasn't from cold. It wasn't even from fatigue exactly. It was that particular kind of tremble that came after too much precision, too much heat, too many hours of repetition without a pause long enough to breathe outside the rhythm. His right thumb had gone fully numb now, a dull weight attached to a hand that barely recognized itself. He clenched it once, slowly, and felt only a faint tingling echo, like the memory of sensation rather than the real thing. His fingers were blackened, not from dirt, but from the forge's quiet signature, soot and heat pressed into skin until it forgot what clean ever meant. The hammer rested on the anvil for now, the rod of iron trimmed down to stubs, not quite enough for another nail. Tomas took that as the forge's version of permission, the briefest of reprieves. He stepped back, wiped his palms on the leather apron that had stopped protecting him somewhere around the 4th year of wear, and turned toward the hearth. The coals were still glowing, content for the moment. Their color, a gentle, pulsing orange, told him they were warm but not angry, the kind of fire that accepted what you gave it without spitting back in protest. He reached for the water barrel. The surface had a layer of ash floating across it like thin gray oil. He stirred it once with a rod, then dipped his hands in. The shock was instant. Not cold, not quite, but colder than him. The nerves in his fingers reacted with surprise, then refusal. He left them in anyway, let the water soak through the soot, bite into the tiny cracks left by hammering and holding. Steam rose from his wrists. It smelled like hot stone after rain. He didn't flinch. He just waited. A few seconds. A minute. Then withdrew them slowly, dripping, and wiped them dry on the cloth nailed to the bench leg. His hands didn't hurt. That was the strange part. They had passed through pain and out the other side into something quieter. Not relief, not healing, just a sort of resignation, the kind that sets in when your body has learned there's no use in complaining if the day hasn't ended yet. He turned back toward the work table, where the next task waited. Not nails, thankfully. This time it was a hinge plate, small, curved, already shaped. It just needed the holes punched and the edge cleaned. Simple, in theory, but small pieces had a tendency to move unexpectedly when hot. The tongs weren't made for delicate work. Tomas pinched the piece gently, held it in the fire just until the edge brightened, then laid it flat on the anvil. He reached for the punch, aligned it, raised the hammer too slow, and struck. The punch skipped, slid. The piece twisted under the tongs, caught the edge of the anvil, and hissed upward toward his wrist. It touched him for half a second, maybe less. Just a brush, but that was enough. The burn sang through his skin like a lesson poorly learned. He dropped the tongs, not in pain, but in irritation. Not again. Not today. He looked down at the wrist. The spot was already red. Blister would follow. Not deep, Not serious, just another mark. His father, still across the room, fitting a chisel head into a new handle, glanced up at the sound. Their eyes met. No words. Just a nod that might have meant you know better, or might have meant keep going. Or maybe both. Tomas didn't answer. He picked up the punch again. Reset the plate. Aligned it properly this time. Hammer. Strike. Clean hole. He did the next two without incident. Hands steady now despite the sting creeping across his wrist. He dipped the plate into the barrel, let it cool, then moved it aside. The forge carried on. The fire hadn't noticed. The coals still breathed in their soft, glowing way, offering neither judgment nor comfort. They simply were. He flexed his hand again, testing the wrist. The burn had gone from sharp to dull. It would blister by morning. He knew this already. It wasn't his first. It wouldn't be his last. Apprentices were expected to burn themselves. Not fatally, not foolishly, but regularly enough to prove they were learning. The trick was not to stop when it happened. That was the unspoken rule. A good blacksmith knew the color of hot iron. A better one knew the smell of singed hair. The best one didn't flinch unless the damage was permanent. Tomas dipped the wrist once more, just briefly, more for the feeling than the function. The cold bit into the skin, which meant the nerves were still working. That was a kind of reassurance. He dried the hand again, returned to the bench, and began the next task. A bridle buckle this time, for a farmer who had traded a chicken for repairs last week. The iron was old, reused from something else, full of memories it didn't want to share. It would resist reshaping. He could tell by the way it flexed in the tongs, but he would shape it anyway. That was the job. His hand trembled again, briefly, then steadied. The blister would rise. It would itch. It would peel. And beneath it, new skin would form, thicker, smarter, slower to burn. That was the only real education the forge offered, injury followed by adaptation. Mistakes paid for in layers of yourself. Tomas set the buckle in the fire, watched the color return to it slowly. The flames licked around the edges, eager, ready. He adjusted the bellows once. Just enough to feed it, not enough to anger it. The forge had moods, after all. Just like the body. He had learned to read both. He turned back to the anvil, picked up the hammer, and let the rhythm return, not because his hand was ready, but because the day was not yet done. The buckle was finished by late morning, though finished was perhaps too ambitious a word. It was shaped, cooled, and passed through a scrap of leather to confirm it functioned. That was enough. Tomas wiped the surface with a rough cloth, left the piece in the delivery box near the door, and stepped back from the anvil for what the forge might generously call lunch. There was no bell, no call, just a slowing of motion, a mutual understanding between him and his father that midday meant the work paused, even if nothing else did. The fire didn't stop burning. The anvil didn't cool. But they did, for a little while. He moved toward the corner where a small bench slouched beneath the tool wall. The seat was narrow, bowed inward from years of leaning and the occasional napping cat. A clay jug of water sat nearby, its spout chipped but still serviceable. He took it in one hand, drank deeply. The water was tepid, slightly smoky. Everything in the forge tasted faintly of soot, including thyme, but it was wet, and that was enough. Beside the jug, wrapped in linen so old it had become more suggestion than fabric, lay a lump of bread, not fresh, not soft, but bread. Tomas unwrapped it, careful not to tear the cloth, and examined it like one might inspect an unfamiliar tool. The crust had hardened to the texture of leather. The interior, if it could be called that, had compressed into a dense grayish mass, vaguely sour and tinged with the scent of yesterday's fire. He broke off a piece. It splintered rather than tore. Still he ate, slowly, carefully. The first bite required some convincing, not from hunger. He was always hungry, but from his jaw, which wasn't eager to fight anything harder than a horseshoe. He chewed until the piece yielded, softened slightly with warmth and persistence. There was no butter, no meat, no vegetable stew, just dry bread and the sound of his own chewing and the forge breathing quietly behind him. A crow called outside. Once, then again. It was the same one, he assumed, that circled the workshop every afternoon around this time. It had a scratchy, unimpressed caw, as if voicing its disapproval that no one ever offered it anything but smoke and metal shavings. Tomas didn't look up. He knew the bird wouldn't come closer. They rarely did. Animals had a sense for places that had no food to spare. The crust of the bread scraped the roof of his mouth, but he finished the first half before setting the rest on the cloth. It would be there later, possibly harder, possibly unchanged. He leaned back against the wall, hands resting on his thighs, and let the moment unfold. Not restful. It was during these in-between moments, after hammering, before more hammering, that Tomas sometimes remembered other things, not dreams. He didn't have those often, but images, shapes of memory that floated through his thoughts like dust motes above the firelight. He thought about the path behind the forge that led to the stream. He hadn't walked it in weeks, maybe longer. The stream ran cold and shallow this time of year, hidden beneath a thin crust of ice and shaded by bare, narrow trees. He used to go there as a boy before the hammer found his hand. He'd dig for stones, build little walls, try to redirect the current like it was a small river waiting for his opinion. He hadn't thought of that stream in a long time. The crow called again. Tomas turned his head slightly, caught a glimpse of it through the small, sooty window. Black feathers, sharp profile, beady eyes that watched the world like it owed them something. The bird tilted its head, then took off, flapping once before vanishing beyond the edge of the frame. He chewed another piece of bread, slower now. His jaw had grown tired. His wrist, bandaged loosely from the burn earlier, throbbed in quiet rhythm. Nothing serious, just a reminder. His father sat across the room, bent over a broken latch. He hadn't spoken all morning, but that wasn't unusual. He only spoke when silence stopped working. The old man ate even less than Tomas, sometimes just a bit of cheese if the goat had been generous, which it rarely was. Bread and water kept them upright. The forge kept them busy. That was the exchange. The second half of the bread remained untouched for now. Tomas picked at a corner, broke off a flake no bigger than a coin, and let it sit on his tongue until it dissolved into grit. Outside, footsteps passed now and then, neighbors, travelers, merchants with empty carts, and the kind of eyes that scanned forge for signs of quick work. The work orders had already filled the shelf above the fire. Tomas didn't look at them. He didn't need to know what was next. He just needed to be ready when it arrived. He shifted on the bench. The wood creaked beneath him. A splinter poked through the side seam of his trousers, old ones, mended so often they had more thread than fabric. He scratched the itch absently, eyes drifting back toward the fire. It had dimmed slightly, not for lack of fuel, but because it too knew how to rest. It blinked slowly, like a tired animal curled beneath a heavy blanket. Tomas liked watching the fire during lunch. Not for warmth, he had enough of that, but for the way it moved. Always moving. Always the same. It never grew bored, never hesitated. It just consumed what it was given and glowed. There was something to be learned from that, he supposed. He finished the water, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stared at the last piece of bread as though it might offer insight. It didn't, but it didn't disappoint either. It was just bread, just enough. He wrapped it again in the linen, tucked it under the jug, and stood. His knees ached slightly. His shoulder cracked once, quietly. He didn't wince, just stretched. The break was over, not by time, but by instinct. The fire was waiting, the tools were ready, and the day, reluctant, familiar, inevitable, was ready to be resumed. The afternoon resumed not with fanfare or readiness, but with the sound of a door hinge groaning under familiar weight. Tomas was wiping down the edge of a file when it happened, the cloth rough against his palm, still faintly damp from the rinse barrel. He didn't turn immediately. The groan of that hinge was rarely followed by good news, and today was proving to be no exception. A man stood just inside the doorway, framed by the haze of sunlight and the ever-present smoke that hovered like a second ceiling in the forge. He was dressed neatly, though not nobly, sturdy boots, woolen coat, gloves tucked into a belt like an afterthought. His hat was off, held politely against his chest, as though manners might sweeten the words he was about to unload. Tomas looked at him, said nothing. His father, across the room, remained hunched over the corner table, pretending not to hear. This, too, was part of the routine. "It's wrong," the man said flatly, stepping forward. "The hinge you made, it creaks. It wasn't supposed to creak." Tomas remembered the order. Small gate latch, left side, with 3 mounting holes. He'd made it just 2 weeks ago. The latch itself had been quiet when tested, but quiet in the forge didn't always mean quiet in the world. Still, he said nothing, and the man added, almost as an afterthought, "The handle is off. Doesn't feel right in the hand. It bites, like a corner's too sharp." Tomas blinked once, slowly, then nodded. Not agreement, not apology, just acknowledgement. The man relaxed slightly. That was the expected response. No defense, no defiance. The forge accepted complaints like coal, dry, regular, and with little ceremony. The man paused then, as if debating whether to continue, or perhaps waiting to see if his grievances had earned him favor. When Tomas didn't speak, the man cleared his throat and shifted his weight. "Actually," he said, more carefully this time, "I've got something else. Not for the latch. Something new. Unusual, maybe. This was never a good sign. Unusual almost always meant unnecessary." "I need a sword," the man continued, "but not for fighting. Not even really for carrying. It's more for, well, for giving. A gift. A sort of symbolic thing." Timmons waited. The man leaned in slightly, eyes flicking once toward the workbench, as if to ensure no one else was listening. Well, no one else ever was. "I want the handle engraved," he said. "With a name." There was a pause. Then, with a nervous chuckle, he added, "Not mine. Hers." Tomas tilted his head, not to question, just to keep listening. "My former betrothed," the man clarified, as though that softened the strangeness. "We ended things. Badly." He stopped, seemingly aware of how that sounded. "Not as a threat," he added quickly. "Just a message. Something elegant. With closure." Tomas blinked again. Not the oddest request he'd received, though certainly in the top 10. His father still hadn't looked up, which meant the job was his. One word, spoken with the weight of a man who knew exactly how this would go. "What name?" The man hesitated, then pulled a folded scrap of paper from his coat. It was clean, folded with purpose. Tomas took it, unfolded it, and read the name inside. 4 letters, elegant, curved. The kind that would take time to cut into metal without turning it into something vulgar. He nodded again, set the paper aside. "Blade?" he asked. "Short," the man said, "like a court sword. Not heavy. Decorative." Tomas didn't ask why the man didn't just buy a brooch or a ring. That wasn't his job. Interpretation was for poets. He was a smith. He made the shapes people couldn't shape themselves, and in this case, that shape happened to include the memory of someone else. "When?" Tomas asked. "3 days," the man said, as though hoping that sounded reasonable. It didn't. But Tomas didn't argue. The man fidgeted for a moment more, then laid a few coins on the table, more than usual. He gave a shallow bow which seemed less about respect and more about discomfort, and then left, the door creaking again in soft protest as it shut behind him. Tomas picked up the coins, glanced at the name once more, and tucked it into the edge of a shelf near the design tools. The name would have to wait until the blade was shaped. Engraving came last, always. He went to the scrap pile, found a suitable piece of steel, narrow, straight-grained, stubborn, and set it on the bench. The fire needed stoking again. The coals had cooled slightly during lunch, waiting for something meaningful to burn. Tomas fed them. Slowly, deliberately. The kindling caught first, then the coal bloomed into its familiar glow, pulsing softly as if it, too, were trying to remember someone's name. He placed the steel into the fire, watched as it began to soften, not melt, just yield, the way memories sometimes did when held up to the heat of unfinished thoughts. The name on the paper lingered in his mind, not as words but as shape, a curve here, a sharp hook there, letters that would soon be more than just sound. They would be etched, not deeply, but permanently enough. The steel began to glow. Tomas reached for the hammer. The rest of the day would be strange, he knew, not worse, not better, just shaped differently by this peculiar request. He pulled the steel from the coals and let the rhythm return, slower now, more precise, each strike bending metal and something else he didn't care to name. The blade was finished late the next evening, after the rest of the forge had gone quiet and the fire had slumped into a comfortable, low huff. Tomas had spent far too much time on the engraving, not because it was difficult, though it was, but because something about the lettering demanded more than precision. Each line had to be just so, each curve clean, not because the name deserved it, but because the steel insisted on being taken seriously. When he finally wiped away the metal dust and held it up to the flickering light, the name glinted faintly, no louder than a whisper, but more permanent than a promise. He didn't sleep much that night. The forge was warm, but the air had shifted, colder than usual, damp with a coming storm. By morning, the roof rattled with the uneven beat of hail. Not heavy, not sharp, just persistent, like a polite disagreement between clouds. His father nodded toward the wrapped blade near the door and gestured at the sky. "You'll have to go now, before it gets worse," he said, handing Tomas the usual bundle of oilcloth, string, and folded linen. Tomas knew better than to delay. Orders weren't just iron and shape. They were expectations, and expectations, like steel, bent poorly if left too long in one position. He wrapped the blade in 2 layers of cloth, tying each corner with care, then tucked the parcel into a leather satchel that had once belonged to someone who traveled more than he did. It smelled faintly of herbs and soot and regret. Outside, the air hit like a wet slap, cold, sharp, the kind that slid down your collar and settled along your spine with no plans of leaving. Tomas pulled his hood low, hunched into his shoulders, and stepped into the road. The village looked half abandoned in this weather, shutters closed, chimneys sighing smoke that sagged under the weight of the wind. Stones underfoot were slick, and each step landed with a squish or a slap, depending on whether the ground was just wet or actively trying to soak his boots. The hail wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Small, round pellets of ice pattered against his cloak, bounced from his satchel, and gathered in quiet clusters along the gutters. Not painful, exactly, but unwelcome in the way that cold always is when you're holding something made with care. The delivery point was 3 roads down and 1 alley over, tucked between a weaver's shop and a lopsided inn that leaned into the wind as if hoping to hide. Tomas knew the door by its dented knocker, a lion's head worn smooth by years of uncertain fists. He raised his hand to knock, paused, then adjusted the bundle once more just to be sure. The cloth was already damp. The outer layer had held for the first few minutes, but the hail had found its way in, persistent and curious, turning crisp edges to damp folds. Still, the blade was safe. Probably. He knocked. A long pause. Then the door opened just wide enough to reveal a nose and eye, a breath of pipe smoke. "Yes?" the voice asked, already tinged with skepticism. "Delivery," Tomas said. "For the sword." The door opened a bit more. A hand reached out. Tomas handed over the satchel. The man, same one from before, same neat coat, now spotted with water, took it gently, then hesitated. "You got it done," he said. "And the engraving?" Tamiz nodded. "It's there." The man looked like he might open the bundle right there in the doorway. Instead, he tucked it under his arm and stepped back inside. "I appreciate it," he added, as if suddenly remembering that gratitude was part of the exchange. He paused. "Was it difficult?" Tomas didn't answer right away. The hail hit his hood with a louder patter. He could feel the cold pressing in through the seams of his clothes. "No," he said finally, "just careful." The man nodded again, a little too many times. "Right, careful. Yes." Tomas stood there for a moment longer, listening to the hail, watching it collect in the creases of the cobblestones like salt spilled by an impatient cook. His hands were wet now. The tips of his fingers ached in that deep, familiar way that didn't speak of injury but of being ignored for too long. He turned, retraced his steps, each one slower than before. The road back to the forge felt longer, though it wasn't. His boots made new squelches in old puddles. The hail softened, then resumed, then softened again, like it couldn't quite decide whether to stay or turn to sleet. At the edge of the forge, he stopped to shake water from his sleeves. A small trickle ran down his arm and into his glove, where it would stay until heat or time forced it out. Inside, the fire welcomed him not with warmth, though it offered that, but with the steady hiss of steam from the quenching barrel, which had been topped off sometime while he was gone. His father looked up, nodded once. "Delivered?" "Vit." "Wrapped," Tomas said. His father didn't press. Just returned to his work, a small iron hook that needed a loop added to the top. Tomas hung his cloak on the peg by the door, steam already rising from the hem. The forge had its own way of drying things. Slow, thorough, forgetful. He rubbed his hands together near the hearth, not to warm them, but to remind them they still existed. The fire snapped gently. The tongs lay where he'd left them. And in the delivery box, a new order slip had appeared, tucked beneath a thin iron bar shaped like a question not yet asked. Tomas picked it up, read it once, and set it down. The hail continued outside. The forge did not notice. The forge never truly emptied, even when the last customer had gone, even when the coals were allowed to shrink into their dull, murmuring rest. Tomas stood by the bench, his shoulders damp, his sleeves steaming faintly, the shape of the road still lingering in his bones. The hail had slowed, now just an occasional ping against the shutters, like a thought trying to get back in. He didn't light another lamp. The forge had enough glow to see by, its heart still pulsing low, like a memory refusing to sleep. He rubbed his hands together one more time, not for warmth now, but out of habit. A ritual the same as setting down the hammer or hanging the cloak or nodding at his father as one might nod to a familiar tree. He turned toward the back corner where a heavy curtain hung from a bent rod of iron. The curtain, brown once, now some indeterminate mix of soot, grease, and old wool, marked the transition from workshop to living quarters. Though quarters was generous, it was a space, a place to lie down, a wall that breathed heat through its own thinness. Tomas pushed the curtain aside and stepped through. The smell changed only slightly. Less smoke, more bread crust, a hint of boiled onions from 3 nights ago. The air was still warm, carried over from the forge, trapped in the low ceiling and rough-hewn beams that looked ready to collapse if ever asked to support a second story. The room was narrow, cluttered, and quiet in a way that didn't feel restful. A small cot sat beneath the far window, which hadn't opened properly in years. The mattress was straw, flattened, matted, occasionally itchy. Beside it, a wooden crate held his clothes, or what remained of them, 2 shirts, 1 pair of trousers, a belt that had outlived its usefulness. A shelf above the cot held a few things that could be mistaken for personal possessions: a small wooden spoon, a dried sprig of lavender, a stone with a hole through the center. Things that didn't mean anything unless you already knew they did. Tomas sat on the cot, boots still on, hands resting in his lap. The heat from the forge bled through the curtain, gentle now, like the last breath of something large that had finally decided it had said enough. He didn't undress. Not yet. The day hadn't quite ended, though the work was paused. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, and let his eyes drift around the small room. The table, only wide enough for 1 plate, had a cloth over it, mostly to hide the burn mark where he dropped a spoon straight from the coals once, back when he was still learning the difference between metal hot from fire and metal that only looked ready. The single chair leaned at a familiar angle, as if bracing for another long hour of watching someone not eat. On the wall opposite the cot, a nail held a lantern, unlit. It hadn't held oil in 2 weeks. Light came from the forge. Always. Even here. Especially here. He could hear his father moving on the other side of the curtain. Not working, just existing. The creak of a bench, the soft clink of tools being returned to places they had already lived in for decades. No voices. There rarely were. Words in the forge were like nails, useful, sharp, but not made for comfort. Tomas leaned back slowly. The cot creaked beneath him. The straw shifted in tiny sighs. He stared at the ceiling. It was low enough that he could touch it if he sat up. Someone had carved a line into one of the beams years ago. A name? A measure? A reminder? It had faded. Whatever it was meant to say, it no longer needed saying. He thought briefly about food. Not because he was hungry, he was always that, but because the body expected it, routine more than desire. There might still be a crust of bread left under the cloth on the table, maybe a slice of cheese hardened to the shape of its wrapping. He didn't move. The idea of chewing felt like too much work. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The sounds of the forge murmured behind the curtain. The pop of a coal collapsing into itself. The sigh of air through the flue. Somewhere outside, the wind nudged a shudder. The curtain moved slightly with the draft, like it too was trying to sleep. But the space didn't offer rest, not really. Rest implied a stopping. This was more of a pause, a soft interlude between one obligation and the next. Even here, behind the curtain, the work clung to his skin, beneath his fingernails, in the aches that spread quietly through his wrists and shoulders like ivy. The forge didn't end where the fire stopped. It lived in the straw, in the blankets that never fully lost their smell, in the air that carried soot the way other homes carried warmth. He opened his eyes again. The ceiling hadn't changed. The light hadn't shifted. He listened to his breath, slow and dry like wind across stone. Then, finally, he bent forward and unbuckled his boots. One, then the other. They came off reluctantly, soles stiff with dried mud and time. He set them beside the cot, heels lined up evenly. A habit, a small order in a world of endless effort. He stood, stretched once, and rolled his shoulders until something popped. The sound echoed in the quiet like a knuckle cracking in church. He didn't wince. He just sat back down, pulled the thin blanket over his legs, and stared at the shadow of the lantern on the wall. Sleep didn't come quickly. It never did. But there was nothing else waiting. Just the fire, still breathing behind the curtain, and the promise that morning would come, bringing with it more metal, more requests, more names that needed to be bent into shape. He didn't drift into sleep, not entirely. It was more of a reclining restfulness, a hovering in that in-between place where the body stops working, but the mind refuses to stop listing unfinished tasks. The fire's fading warmth seeped through the wall, a quiet reminder that time was still moving even if he wasn't. Somewhere between the first shift of straw and the second creak of wood above him, his stomach made a low sound, not loud but distinct, like a question it already knew the answer to. That sound meant dinner, or at least the ritual of sitting with something warm. Hunger, by this point in the evening, was less of a sensation and more of a fact, like gravity or iron fatigue. He sat up slowly, rubbing one eye with the back of his wrist and listening for any new sounds on the other side of the curtain. None came, just the soft, constant breathing of cooling coals and the occasional knock of wind against the shuttered glass. The forge had gone quiet in its own way, still alive, but no longer interested in announcing it. Tomas swung his legs over the side of the cot, felt the chill of the floorboards through his worn socks, and reached for the small clay pot tucked beneath the table. It was wrapped in a frayed towel, the kind with permanent scorch marks, and one corner singed to a twist. Inside the pot was the closest thing they had to supper. It didn't have a name, not exactly. Naming meals implied intention. This had none. It had been soup once, maybe, or stew. Or something in between. Started 3 days ago with a bit of barley, half an onion, and some rind shaved from the edge of a smoked ham that hadn't been seen since winter. Whatever it had started as, it had slowly transformed with time, with heat, and with the slow addition of whatever remained in the bottom of their larder. The resulting mixture was grayish, thin, and had the consistency of something that once remembered being food, but it was hot. And that was its most redeeming feature. He poured a ladleful into a dented tin bowl, the kind that always sat unevenly unless placed just right. The steam rose in soft curls, bringing with it a smell that couldn't be described without apology. It wasn't unpleasant, just ambiguous. A bit earthy, a bit sour, possibly root-based. He tore off the remaining crust of bread from under the cloth and dipped it into the bowl, letting it soak until the outside darkened and the inside, what little was left of it, softened into something manageable. He took the first bite slowly, more to gauge temperature than taste. It was warm, just shy of too warm, and surprisingly comforting. The texture wasn't smooth, but the warmth spread through his chest like a polite fire. He didn't rush. Meals like this weren't about eating. They were about stopping. About recognizing that the day had moved forward and required marking, even if only with a bowl of hot, edible mystery. He ate slowly, not because he had to, but because fast eating made it disappear too quickly. The warmth was the best part. It settled into his arms, his shoulders, his fingers. It softened the ache that had started at his elbow and spread downward after the fifth hinge that morning. Each spoonful was followed by silence. The room had no other purpose during these hours. He didn't speak. His father didn't appear. Supper was a solitary act, even when shared across a curtain. The wind had picked up again, rattling something loose on the roof, likely the same shingle that had refused to stay nailed for 3 winters in a row. Tomas ignored it. The roof would hold. Or it wouldn't. Neither changed the fact that the soup, or its cousin, was doing its job. He dipped another piece of bread. It dissolved faster now. The crust had surrendered fully. His spoon scraped against the bottom of the bowl, dragging across the faint memory of carrots or perhaps parsnip. He didn't mind. The scraping was part of the process. When the bowl was empty, he stared at it for a moment, not with longing, just assessment. It had fed him. That was enough. He placed it on the table, slightly off-center, and wiped his hands on the cloth still resting on his lap. The towel absorbed little. It was more a gesture than a utility. He sat back against the wall, listening again. The forge was quiet now, truly quiet. The kind of quiet that only came after fire had settled into embers and the metal had stopped dreaming of heat. He thought briefly of tomorrow's work, the blade needing polish, the brace for the wheelwright, the strange hook ordered by someone whose handwriting suggested trouble. But he didn't dwell. The warmth in his stomach was beginning to stretch upward into his chest, his throat softening everything it touched. He yawned, not loudly, just enough to shift the air around his face. The bowl would stay there till morning. He knew that. The ladle, too. No one would move them. The curtain fluttered once in the draft, then settled. He leaned forward again, reached for the blanket on the cot, and folded it over his legs. The weight of the day pressed against him, not heavily, not cruelly, just fully, like a blanket too big for the bed, but not heavy enough to remove. And somewhere between the last hint of heat from the soup and the creak of the wood above him, he let his eyes close again, not for sleep, not yet, but for the idea of sleep, which was sometimes enough. The warmth from the thin soup lingered, but only barely, curling quietly in the pit of Thomas's stomach like a small, drowsy animal too tired to stretch. His body, while used to days like this, had settled into its usual late evening state of slow rebellion, wrists stiff, shoulders dense, knees uncertain. But above all, it was his feet that now demanded attention. They had been ignored the longest, encased in the same leather shoes that had seen 2 winters, 4 cracked soles, and enough coal dust to suggest they had lived a second life beneath the forge itself. He looked down at them, those familiar worn shapes bulging slightly at the sides where the stitching had stretched and the laces no longer held tension. One of the heels leaned inward, permanently reshaped by how he tended to stand, left foot flat, right foot bent just slightly, as if listening for the next thing that would go wrong. He knew he should remove them. He always waited too long. There was no ceremony to it, not really. But there was significance. More than the bread, more than the soup, more even than closing the curtain that separated cot from anvil, this was the true end of the day. He shifted forward slightly on the straw mattress, bracing one hand behind him for balance. The cot creaked, its wooden slats groaning like they, too, had something to say about the long hours. He bent forward slowly, fingers aching a little more than expected, and tugged gently at the left shoe. It resisted, of course. The heel clung to his sock with a sort of damp loyalty, a final defiance against separation. He twisted slightly, pulled harder, and it gave with a soft, reluctant schlup. The moment it slipped off, a sigh escaped him, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. His foot, now free, twitched once, as though waking from a long, bad dream. The sock underneath, a grayish lump of once wool, was misshapen, fraying at the toe, and damp enough that it glistened faintly in the low forge light. He didn't remove it yet. That came next. For now, he just let the foot breathe, flexing the toes slowly, feeling the stale warmth of the room wrap around the raw cool of exposed skin. Then came the right foot. This one was harder. It had swollen slightly, as it did most days, the result of too many hours standing still and moving metal with muscles that didn't always agree on whose turn it was to ache. He braced both hands against his shin and tugged. The shoe gave a little, then caught again at the arch. He adjusted, angled his heel, and pulled harder. This time it came free with a faint pop, a puff of warmth, and a smell that immediately made him lean back and blink slowly at the wall. There were no words for that smell. It had evolved past description into something elemental. The foot beneath was no better than the first. The sock sagged at the ankle, its fibers giving up any pretense of elasticity. A small hole near the heel had widened over the past week into something approaching a window. He wiggled his toes again, staring at the mottled shapes of his feet, neither quite clean nor fully calloused, just present. They looked tired. Not injured, not ruined, but tired in the way a road might look after too many cartwheels. He peeled the left sock slowly, the fabric clinging like wet parchment. It came away with the sound of separation, and he held it for a moment before dropping it beside the cot. The foot underneath was pale in places, red in others, a patch of skin near the big toe rubbed raw but not bleeding. He repeated the process with the other sock, carefully, methodically, as though removing something delicate instead of something slowly falling apart. Both socks landed in the same heap, quietly resigned. He stretched out both legs, pointing his toes, then flexing them back toward his shins. The stretch sent a slow wave of sensation through his calves, dull at first, then sharper. He let the feeling settle. Naros. There was nowhere to go. His feet lay flat now on the worn boards of the floor, which were surprisingly warm, likely from the forge's stubborn heat, sneaking through every crack it could find. He pressed his heels into the floor, feeling the slight grit of ash beneath them. He didn't care. That was the floor's purpose. It held what the forge let go. He sat like that for a long moment, breathing, not thinking. The act of removing his shoes always felt final, even if the day wasn't quite done. It was the signal his body waited for, the cue to release whatever tension had been stored in his spine, his hips, the back of his neck. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at his feet again. They didn't thank him. Feet never do. But there was a mutual understanding now, an agreement between worn leather and worn skin that their work, for the moment, had paused. In the quiet, he could hear his father cough once, from the other side of the curtain. Not loud, not urgent. Just the kind of sound a man makes to remind the room that he's still breathing. Tomas didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He reached for the thin blanket folded at the foot of the cot, shook it once to dislodge the dust, and laid it over his legs, careful to tuck the edge beneath his heels. He didn't cover the feet entirely. They still needed a moment. They had earned that. The forge popped once, a coal settling into itself, a soft exhale from something that knew exactly how it felt to hold weight for too long. Tomas leaned back again, his shoulders resting against the wall, and let his eyes fall halfway closed. Not asleep, not yet, just a little more detached from the shape of the room. His feet pulsed softly, a gentle reminder that they were, at last, free. The rest of him would follow soon enough. The feet had cooled enough to be ignored. Not forgotten, they never allowed that, but quieted, the way a kettle might simmer just below a boil if you stopped listening to it. Tomas remained still for another minute, then maybe another after that, his fingers tracing small shapes into the worn blanket as if reminding himself he was still here, still solid. The heat from the forge wall had faded into a soft suggestion of warmth. The room had grown dim, not dark, lit only by the low glow of cooling coals beyond the curtain. Sleep hovered, nearby, but not close enough to touch. And even now, even with his shoes off and his bones aching, there was one last ritual to perform before the day could be allowed to forget him. Cleaning the tools wasn't a rule, not exactly. No one had ever said it aloud, not even his father. It was simply known. Understood. Tools, like habits, needed tending. Tomas stood slowly, stretching first one leg, then the other, feeling the stiffness settle in like a familiar weight. He moved quietly, as if sound might delay the process. His feet, bare against the floor, felt each board's imperfection, each nail head slightly raised from too many years of footsteps. He passed through the curtain without lifting it fully, letting it drape across his shoulders for a moment before slipping into the forge's heart. The space hadn't changed. It never really did. The coals had slumped into a warm, breathing pile of red and black. The anvil sat alone and faintly steaming in the center, and the tools, his tools, lay across the bench in the exact arrangement he had left them. It wasn't disorderly. It wasn't neat. It was intentional. He approached them slowly, as one might approach something sleeping. The cloth was already waiting, draped over the edge of the table like a tired handkerchief, stiff with oil, dark at the corners, threadbare in the middle. Tomas picked it up, folded it once, and began. The hammer came first. Not the large sledge, but the mid-sized forging hammer with the slightly uneven handle that had molded itself to his grip over the years. He wiped the head slowly, carefully, turning it in the light to catch the smudges of soot, the faint rings of moisture, the invisible flecks of iron that had landed and stayed. He rubbed in small, deliberate circles, not fast, not slow, just enough. The handle got the same treatment, though it was more symbolic. Sweat did more to seal wood than oil ever could. Next came the tongs, long, awkward, angular. Each pair had a mouth shaped for something specific, one for flat bars, another for rounded stock, a third for horseshoe arches that had long since stopped appearing. He didn't use them all anymore, but they were part of the family now. He wiped each jaw, each hinge, each grip. The cloth darkened with use, but he kept folding it, finding new corners that hadn't yet served. He moved to the punches next. Smaller, easier to forget, but just as vital. The pointed ones used for decorative work, the blunt ones for starter holes, the one with a chipped edge that still hadn't been repaired because it still worked if held just right. He cleaned them all, methodically, as if someone might inspect them in the morning. No one would. His father never did. Not once in all the years of Tomas handling the tools. But the act mattered. It was what separated the work from the waiting. He polished the file last, though it didn't polish well. Its teeth caught the cloth and bit back, a reminder that not all surfaces were meant to shine. Still, he passed over it once, twice, as if the motion itself could soften the edge of the day. When he finished, he laid the tools back down, not precisely, but purposefully, the hammer near the edge, the tongs fanned out like branches, the punches lined in a neat row that curved slightly at the end. He stepped back, looked, adjusted one tong by a finger's width, then nodded. The forge was still quiet. The coals no longer hissed. Just a soft crackle now and then, like old thoughts shifting in their sleep. Tomas returned the cloth to its nail on the wall, where it would dry just enough to be stiff again by morning. He wiped his hands on the thighs of his trousers, though they were no cleaner now than they had been before. He stood there for another moment, staring at the tools, not admiring them, just making sure they remembered they were part of something. He didn't believe in luck, but he did believe in readiness, and readiness in a forge was a kind of faith. He turned slowly, pausing at the anvil, where a few small curls of iron had gathered at the base, shavings from the blade the day before, now cooled into useless spirals. He bent, picked one up, and rolled it between his fingers. Cold. Light. It made no sound. He placed it on the edge of the work table, a small gesture that had no meaning outside of this moment. Then he crossed the room, pushed aside the curtain again, and stepped back into the soft dim of what they called home. His feet found the same boards, his cot the same shape, his blanket the same musty welcome. But now the tools were clean, the workbench was quiet, and the forge, finally, was still. Even with the tools cleaned and the day's noise filed away like yesterday's embers, the forge remained alive, its coals in that fragile state between warmth and memory, glowing faintly like a heartbeat slowing but not yet stopped. Tomas sat on the edge of the workbench, legs dangling, boots lying neatly below, but still there, a reminder of the day that had passed. The fire's light flickered across the anvil, painting it in shifting shades of soft orange and pale gray. Tomas stared at the metal, tracing the familiar curves of its worn top with tired eyes. The bench beneath him was cold, yet the forge itself felt warm enough to cradle thoughts. He shifted his hands into his lap and let his mind wander. The anvil stood quietly, squat and patient, its surface marred with marks from countless strikes, each one a promise that thundered and then faded. Tomas remembered the day he first heard that promise, from the very moment he gripped a hammer heavier than himself and struck iron that would not yield easily. The anvil never judged. It only received. And for that reason, it had become a kind of quiet judge, too. He wondered if, after all the years and metal bits left in its grooves, it knew anything at all. Could it feel fatigue? Could it remember the weight of a hammer he alone could not remember? He turned his head slightly to glance at the hammer, resting across the bench's surface. It lay there like a sleeping beast, handle darkened by sweat and coal, head chipped at the edge where it had met too many stubborn billets. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. The hammer had no purpose until heat and tongs demanded it, until brass or steel insisted on shape. But for a moment he looked at it as if it had life, as if it carried more than metal, instead carrying whole days in its shadow. He paused, breathing slowly. The forge murmured behind him, sometimes like a sigh, sometimes like the soft clearing of a throat. He listened. He considered the coal. After all day of feeding it, coaxing it, pushing it with puffed bellows and caustic smoke, it had finally slipped toward dormancy. The edges of the coals went black, the center dimmed, the fire reduced to lifeless possibility. Tomas thought about whether he should add coal in the morning or let it start cold, feel its timer begin then. Replacing coal wasn't just maintenance, it was a renewal ritual. A question of how tomorrow would start. Would it begin in glowing warmth or with cold ash creaking back to life? He didn't know. He didn't care. Not yet. Right now, the waiting seemed more important, more honest. The sound of his breathing synchronized with the soft hiss of dying embers. The anvil remained still, the hammer unmoved. The cœur refused to shine. He sat there until his reflection appeared in the polished face of a kettle hanging above the hearth, smudged, weary, but steady. The kettle had little water left in it, its handle angled like a borrowed arm, ready to pour. He gazed at himself, a man shaped by repeated motion and persistent silence, marked by tiny scars and a horizon of fatigue that began at his shoulders and stretched down to his boots. He wondered if the forge saw him the same way, as part of its echo, no one voice louder than the other, but all necessary. He shifted again, the wood creaking under his weight. Outside, the wind sighed against the shutter, a distant percussion to his thoughts. In the silence, he felt changes in his own chest, the steady rise and fall that no hammer could alter. He thought of tomorrow, the orders waiting, the coals needing coaxing, the bellows waiting for breath. And he thought of himself standing in the gap between flame and shape, tool and maker, routine and possibility. He didn't feel anything dramatic. No revelation, no longing, just that quiet awareness that this moment, the moisture of his lips, the ache in his bones, the warmth fading, was everything that forged him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and pressed his palms together as if praying. The bang of metal on metal had faded. Only warmth, only echo, only him and the forge deciding if they were done or merely delayed. Ripples, yes, but no noise. He opened his eyes. The coals glowed a bit more around the edges, acknowledging the word, perhaps. The anvil waited. The hammer remained still. And Tomasas, aware that done was never quite true in a forge, that pause might carry him forward into flame or stillness, depending on what morning demanded. Eventually, the coals dimmed to the point where they no longer offered light, only a vague suggestion of warmth that tried and failed to reach his shoulders. Tomas rose slowly from the edge of the bench, joints stiff with a tiredness that had settled in deep, not as pain exactly, but as the weight of a long, repetitive life. The forge no longer murmured. Even the wind outside had lost interest in rattling the shutters. Everything felt quieter than before, not peaceful, just quiet in the way an emptied barrel was quiet, waiting for something to fill it again. He walked back through the curtain with the sluggish momentum of someone whose limbs had not yet convinced his thoughts that rest was permitted. His feet, still bare from earlier, shuffled slightly across the floor, tracing the familiar path between soot and straw, between the end of work and the beginning of sleep that wasn't quite rest. The cot greeted him like an old agreement, a surface slightly wider than his shoulders, layered in a blanket that never fully forgot the day's soot, and a pile of straw that had long since stopped pretending to be bedding. The straw shifted beneath the thin sheet as he sat, crackling faintly in protest, the way it always did. It was never soft, not even close. Some pieces were bent, others stiff, and one or two inevitably found their way into a position sharp enough to question his loyalty to the idea of lying down. Still, it was what he had. And, more importantly, it was where he always ended up. He eased himself back into the pile, adjusting the straw with minimal effort because rearranging it didn't really help. It poked. It scratched. It made his back itch before he'd even stopped moving. One stalk pressed against the base of his neck. Another jabbed at his left shoulder blade. He sighed, not dramatically, just enough to shift a bit more weight into a different spot that might be marginally less offensive. The blanket barely covered him. It always stopped short, leaving one ankle or one shoulder exposed to the forge's ghost heat. Tonight it left his left foot free, and he didn't bother fixing it. The ache in his lower back, that deep, persistent throb from standing too long and leaning forward too much, settled in like a quiet reminder, not sharp enough to demand anything, just present, just part of things. He stared at the ceiling, or the idea of a ceiling too dark now to see. The rafters overhead creaked softly in the wind. A nail somewhere tapped against a loose board. The noises were familiar, old companions to a body sinking into scratchy straw. He let his thoughts drift, not on purpose, but because focus required effort he didn't have. He thought about the fire, about the faint hiss when the last glowing coal collapsed into ash. He thought about the hammer's weight, the one he hadn't picked up since polishing it earlier. He thought about the customer from 2 days ago who had asked for a latch shaped like a leaf and then returned it because it looked too much like a leaf. His mind flickered between these small, unfinished shapes, like watching embers blink in a dark hearth, glowing for a second, then gone. His back tensed briefly as he shifted again. One stalk of straw slid beneath his ribs and refused to be ignored. He reached down blindly and tugged it out, flicking it to the floor without ceremony. It joined the others, the scattered reminders of many nights exactly like this. His fingers traced the edge of the blanket, smoothing it out along his side, then curling it over his chest as far as it would go. The chill of the room hadn't deepened, not exactly. It had just become more honest now that the forge had nothing left to give. He exhaled slowly, deeply, letting the breath fill the small space and then fade into the corners. His eyelids fluttered, not closed yet, but nearly. His body wasn't relaxed, but it had stopped resisting. The itch on his shin didn't matter. The ache in his left elbow could wait. The straw beneath him might have been worse than the day before, but he had no interest in judging it. He was too tired to care. Sleep wasn't a thing that arrived with ceremony. It crept in sideways, disguised as stillness, as silence, as the absence of needing to do anything else. He didn't close his eyes fully, not yet. He let them drift downward, lashes brushing against his cheekbone as the faint warmth of the forge's memory curled around his ankles. The straw crackled once beneath him. A spider moved along the wall, or maybe that was just the sound of wood shifting again. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if he'd remember to check the coal bin in the morning. He probably would. He usually did. The thought circled once, then settled. The straw wasn't comfortable. It never had been. But it held him, not kindly, not cruelly, just the way it always had. He inhaled once more, the air dry and a little metallic, and let the sound of nothingness fill the room. Not peaceful, but steady. Not silent, but full of things that knew how to wait. His thoughts didn't end. They simply slowed, and the forge, now dark, kept its final embers in secret, like a heartbeat saving warmth for whoever might need it next. Somewhere in the shallow tide between almost asleep and almost awake, Tomas began to drift, not sharply, not suddenly, but with the slow pull of something inevitable, like dusk drawing across a tired sky. The scratch of straw beneath his back softened to a texture less precise, the ache in his shoulders dissolved into ambient hum, and the last stubborn awareness of his toes slipped into quiet. He didn't remember closing his eyes. He never did. Sleep took him not with force, but with quiet permission. At first he dreamed of nothing in particular, only warmth or the memory of it, and a faint sense of floating just above the floor. But then slowly something clearer took shape. Not vivid, not loud, just present in the way a breeze might be noticed before it's felt. He was standing in a field, not a grand one, not lush, but wide and low, the grass short and yellowed in the gentle way of things left to be. There was no forge, no smoke, no iron tang in the air. The sky was flat and pale, not blue or gray, but some color that didn't insist on a name. Under his feet the earth was firm, not muddy, not cracked, just there, just earth. He looked down and found his hands were empty. No hammer, no soot, no calluses that throbbed with memory. He rubbed one thumb against the other and found the skin soft, almost new. There were no tongs hanging at his side. No apron cinched across his chest. He wore nothing that smelled of sweat and oil. He was only there, clothed in something forgettable, but dry and whole. There were no buildings on the horizon, no fences, no roads cut by wheels or hooves. Just the field stretching in all directions with the patient stillness of something too humble to speak. The wind was soft, not cold. It brushed his hair in a way no real wind ever had, as if trying not to wake anything. In the distance, something moved. Not a person, not a horse, just a ripple of the land, breathing. Tomas stepped forward. The grass gave way without complaint. No thorns. No stones. No iron filings underfoot. Each footfall was quiet, almost musical. He didn't know where he was going. The field had no center, no edge, but there was no urgency in him. No orders to remember, no tools to clean, no coals to coax into flame. The memory of the forge was still inside him somewhere, but faint now. It no longer held weight, only shape. His hand drifted to his side instinctively, searching for the familiar handle of the hammer that had lived there for years, but there was nothing. He smiled without realizing. It didn't feel like something lost. It felt like something set down. The field curved gently upward, not a hill exactly, more of a suggestion. As he reached the rise, the wind pressed a little more firmly against his back, not pushing, just accompanying. At the top, he paused. Below was more of the same, more quiet, more field. And in the center of that stillness, oddly and perfectly placed, was a pillow. Not a throne, not a bench. Just a simple, soft, white pillow, plump and inviting, as though someone had left it there with deliberate kindness. Tomas walked down toward it. The slope was easy. The grass whispered against his ankles. As he approached, the pillow seemed to glow, not brightly, not with magic, but with a softness he had never seen in fabric before. It didn't belong here, and yet it was the only thing that did. He sat beside it first, knees folding beneath him. He reached out and touched the fabric with the tips of his fingers. It was cool. Cool and impossibly clean. The kind of clean no forge blanket had ever been. It felt like sleep before sleep. He lay down, head settling into the center, the pillow molding around him with the quiet enthusiasm of something that had waited a long time for this moment. He closed his eyes. The field hummed. The wind paused as if nodding in approval. In this dream there were no tools to count, no coal to measure, no orders to fulfill, no metal to tame, no need to remember what had been forged or forgotten. In this dream there were no anvils waiting, no bellows breathing, no hammer strikes keeping time. There was only the feeling of breath slowing, of muscles releasing, of weight no longer asked to carry anything. Somewhere far away in the waking world, the forge still stood, the tools still rested, the coals still cooled. But here in this dream, in this field, Tomas lay in a world untouched by iron, and as his dream deepened, stretching into the endless quiet of rest earned slowly over years of heat and hammer, the field remained still, and the pillow, soft and sure, held him as gently as if he had never known the weight of anything else. And so we gently lay down the hammer and let the anvil rest, closing the worn curtain on the quiet, tireless world of the medieval blacksmith. In the soft fading glow of the forge, we leave behind the clang of iron and the sting of soot, those simple sounds that shaped an age without ever asking for thanks. Through each blistered hand, each sleepless night beside glowing coals, these forgotten craftsmen held the line between necessity and endurance. They didn't dream of glory. They dreamed of heat that held, of tools that didn't break, of a bed that didn't itch quite so much, and maybe, once in a while, of a world with no metal at all. As you sink into sleep tonight, perhaps let your thoughts wander back to their quiet corner of history where work spoke louder than words and the rhythm of life was measured not in comfort, but in steady, uncelebrated toil. Rest now and let the final wisps of forge smoke carry you into a sleep as deep and undisturbed as a coal bed at dawn.